appeasement. I'm sure you recall from when you were in school that one of the classic examples of appeasement was when Neville Chamberlain was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Neville Chamberlain was convinced it would work. Neville Chamberlain said that we'll have peace in our time. Neville Chamberlain was wrong. Now, I know people will say it's easy enough to see that in hindsight, and that is true. There were also people warning at the time about the dangers of it. Winston Churchill was one of those people. I'd really encourage people to read as much as they can by and about Winston Churchill. Aside from the fact that he recognized the dangers of appeasement ahead of time, there is much else that he foresaw and warned about, from the Russian Revolution to many other problems. I'd really encourage people to read about that. I don't want to go into detail on that. Just to put that out there, I'd really encourage people to read it, aside from the main topic of this video, but it'd be worth people's time. Now back to Neville Chamberlain. He really thought that his policy of appeasement worked. As he went crawling across Europe and licking Hitler's boots, he thought that that worked. He handed over peoples to Nazi rule in order to accomplish it, and it turned out just to be a temporary peace. Churchill was warning about this all along, that you can't negotiate with someone like Hitler. Churchill, for his trouble, was called a warmonger. But Churchill really had the right idea. Turns out, in the end, we had to fight Nazi Germany anyway. The UK, the US, Canada, the whole free world was dragged into this war. Appeasement. In our grade school and junior high and high school history lessons, that was one of the big lessons that is brought up, is that appeasement does not work. It was most dramatically showed in World War II that it does not work. Had the United Kingdom or the USA or both dealt with the Nazi problem sooner, there would have been much less bloodshed. England very well could still have the empire they lost leading up to World War II. It had a profound effect on history because people did not see the signs soon enough. Détente does not work. Appeasement does not work. And it falls on the shoulders of the leader who comes along after the appeaser, as it did with Churchill. We have fast forward to the 1970s, and Jimmy Carter is in office. And what is Jimmy Carter trying to do? He's trying to establish détente with the Soviets, Russians, communists. He was an appeaser, and he undermined the Shah because of human rights abuses. The Shah was the best thing Iran had going for it. And yes, the Shah did rule with an iron fist. Someone said of the Shah that you aren't like monarch of another country. I believe it was Sweden. The Shah said, I'll be like the monarch of Sweden when I have subjects like the monarch of Sweden has. The monarch of Sweden did not have a bunch of bloodthirsty religious nuts to deal with. And we're seeing that now that the Shah has been deposed. How truly dangerous those people are. Or we should be. Jimmy Carter didn't learn the lessons of Neville Chamberlain. Ronald Reagan had to deal with the fallout from that. Much like Churchill, Reagan looked like a warmonger because of the incompetence in foreign policy of Jimmy Carter. Had the Russians with territorial ambitions in Afghanistan. You had the problem with the Cuban soldiers in Grenada, the nuclear arms race. But at least Reagan had the courage to do what he did, to outdo the Russians, and that helped them collapse. Reagan didn't believe in détente. It's destructive. Détente is basically another word for appeasement. And we're dealing with the same thing now with Obama. He's bowing and scraping to other world leaders. He's not protecting our nation. He's making the world a more dangerous place. The situation in Iran is dangerous. It's an attempt at appeasement. John Kerry has said that the Iranians can be trusted because the fatwa is of extreme religious and cultural importance to them. In theory, I suppose. You know, I guess he read about the Iranian culture in college. But the reality is the Iranians saw John Kerry coming a mile away. He's so desperate for this deal that he's losing all sight of reality. And maybe he's desperate for it because he might want to run for president. I don't know what the man's motivation is. But he's losing sight of how dangerous this is, how it's destructive to American interests, and how it's just a very dangerous situation with a very dangerous government. These Iranians are up to no good. And one of the news releases I read about this were John Kerry actually wants to give them a reactor in order to cement this deal. Talk about appeasement. Now go back to what I was saying about how the leader that comes after the appeaser, and this can also be applied to ISIS, because we pulled out of Iraq, and that's what allowed ISIS to do what it's doing now. Dick Cheney was warning against pulling out of Iraq early. We had the SOFA agreement, the Status of Forces agreement, and we didn't live up to our word on that. And we left these poor Iraqi people hanging, and now look what they're dealing with. But that's appeasement too. ISIS and Iran are just opposite sides of the same coin. And we're appeasing them. So what does that mean for the next president of the United States? That means that they're going to have to deal with the consequences of this appeasement. And they'll be branded a warmonger, the same way Reagan was, the same way Churchill was, because Churchill didn't want to appease, Reagan didn't want to appease, and if the next president of the United States has any brains, he won't want to appease, but he will be called a warmonger by the left. When none of this would be happening if we'd stayed in Iraq, if we just left a few thousand troops there, ISIS would not be doing what it's doing now. We do have status of forces agreement in Germany and Japan to this day. And we're still in Germany and Japan, 70 years after the end of World War II. A few thousand American soldiers in Baghdad, it was worth it to prevent the kind of destruction we're seeing now from ISIS. And it's appeasement. If we just give them one more thing, they'll be happy, except then they want something else. That's exactly in the pattern of Hitler back in the 30s. and we're falling for it again. Despite all those lessons in school about the dangers of appeasement, no one learns. Most of all, those in power that are making the decisions never learn. Could very well be for purely political reasons. These people are so cynical, they're willing to sell the American citizens down the road for power. That's exactly why they like people on welfare. That gives them power. They're that cynical, they're that craven, they're that wanton. They'll do anything for power. I believe including this. I don't believe President Obama loves this country. Rudy Giuliani said so, and then he backed off of that statement. I lost respect for Giuliani over that. I do not believe this president loves this country. I don't believe he cares about this country. I don't believe he cares about the American people at all. Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel came here and spoke in Congress about the dangers of appeasing Iran. Still, no one is heeding the warning. When the history is written on this, he's going to be the one that's seen with the foresight of someone like Churchill, because he has been warning about this. But like Churchill back in the 30s and 20s, no one's listening to Netanyahu. No one will realize how dangerous this is until the fight gets much tougher and much more dangerous, much more costly in money and equipment and lives, and people still aren't learning their lessons.